Task 1. Basics of containerization. First, we're going to clone the GitHub repository into some directory and then check out the branch of the first task. There are 3 folders in the Docker Compose file. 2 folders are for respective Docker containers, and another one is for client that will run outside of Docker. We needed to look at how port mapping works. The client and the database are just simple Python programs. The database program hosts an SQLite database using the SQLite 3 Python library for that. It also runs a simple TCP server that only allows for one connection at a time. If the connection drops, it will start searching again for new connections. The client is a console app that tries to connect to a TCP server on a given IP. It converts everything that is typed into its console to JSON format and sends it to the server it is connected to. To be honest, I don't really understand how to correctly set up such a connection, but essentially when the server and the client are connected, the server will wait for data from the client. Buffer size in this particular example is set to 16 bytes. To demonstrate that the messages are actually restored from being cut into parts, although if somehow any of the ends of the connection receive a second message before having dealt with the first one, the messages will not be separated and will be treated as a single message, resulting in a JSON parser throwing an exception. But this situation should not really happen because the client does not allow for sending a second message before receiving an answer to the first one. Now for the Docker part. The client Docker file simply specifies that it should be built on top of Python 3 image and then copy the source code to build its own image. When running a container from this image, it will run the Python program as instructed by the CMD. The server Docker file is the same, except it also specifies that it listens on port 8000 for TCP connections. For the compose file, it specifies service names for database and client. By default, compose sets up a single network for the app. Each service creates a container that joins the default network. The container is reachable within this network by its service name. So the compose file also sets up the environment so both the client and the server know what to connect to and where to search for a connection. It also specifies a volume for persistent database storage and tells that a specific directory in the server container should be associated with that volume. Lastly, it maps the localhost port 8000 to port 8000 of the database server. How this works is going to be shown at the end. Now we're going to actually run the app. For that, we're going to type docker compose up build with detach to attach the client our own way with the next command. Then we're gonna open another terminal to see the logs of the database container. The setup part is over and now we can query the database. First, let's create a table. Now we're going to write some data into this table using insert. And finally we can retrieve it with select to see that the data is actually there. Everything seems to work, and now if we docker compose down the app, if we try to list all containers, we can see that the containers are gone. But since we created a volume, our database was saved in there, and if we docker compose up again and attach to a newly created client, and if we try to select all from our example table, we get our data again. This means that the new server container is using the same volume that the last one was using, and it has everything that was in there. Now we are going to connect to the database from localhost to demonstrate how port mapping works. Just like I said before, this line right here maps port 8000 of the localhost to port 8000 of the container. This means that we can connect to the localhost on this port and everything will be redirected to the container. First, I'm going to close this client. Then we are going to start the client that runs outside of Docker with this command. As you can see, we got a new connection and we can query the same database now from outside of Docker. Here we got the same 3 rows from the example table. Lastly, to clean everything up, we will stop this client and run docker compose down with remove images and volumes. That's it. That's the project. The GitHub link with all the commands I used is in the description. Thanks for watching. Bye.